That night, just as the last traces of twilight faded into the black, a strange stillness settled over Willow Creek. Sam sat on the porch of the aging farmhouse, his boots tapping restlessly against the wooden steps. The air was heavy, almost trembling with an unseen tension, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The old weather vane atop the barn creaked uncertainly, twisting in winds that had not yet fully come. Then, without warning, the sky broke open. Thunder cracked like cannon fire, rattling the windows and their loose frames. Jagged lightning tore across the heavens, illuminating the dying fields in a ghastly, fleeting white. Rain fell in violent sheets, hammering the tin roof with a deafening roar, turning the dirt paths into thick *king mud within minutes. Sam didn't move. He simply sat there, staring out into the chaos, the brim of his battered hat dripping rainwater onto his already soaked jacket. He watched as the struggling stalks of corn, the last survivors of a losing battle against drought and despair, were thrashed and flattened by the merciless storm. Years of work, seasons of hope, all torn down in a single brutal night. By morning, the storm had passed, but it left behind a silence that screamed louder than any tempest. Sam's boots sank into the soaked earth as he trudged out to the fields. The destruction was complete. The neat rows he had so carefully planted were no longer recognizable. Stalks lay broken and battered across the ground, their yellowed leaves twisted into unnatural shapes. Pools of muddy water reflected a gray, indifferent sky. He knelt beside a withered plant, its roots half torn from the ground, and cradled it in his hands for a moment. It was a pointless gesture, there was no saving anything now. The drought had starved the land, and the storm had finished the job. His heart felt heavier than the leaden sky above him. Inside his worn jacket, the final mortgage notice pressed against his chest like a silent judge. The creases in the paper were deep and sharp from the number of times Sam had unfolded it, trying to find some loophole in the words, some small miracle hidden between the cold lines of legalese. There were no miracles. Just a date, circled in red ink, and the looming certainty that this land, passed down through generations, would slip from his grasp. He walked the length of the field slowly, the way a man might walk through the ruins of a home after a fire. His footsteps left shallow impressions in the mud, quickly filling with water, vanishing almost as soon as he passed. Nothing left a mark anymore. Back at the house, he stripped off his soaked jacket and hung it on the old coat rack, though it sagging slightly from years of burden. His hands, rough and cracked, shook slightly as he poured himself a cup of coffee from the dented thermos he kept beside the door. It had long gone cold, but he drank it anyway, feeling the bitterness coat his throat. The kitchen was dim, the light bulb over the sink flickering sporadically. The cracked linoleum floor was littered with drops of muddy water from his boots, but he made no move to clean them. Instead, he sat heavily at the small table, the same table his father had once pored over seed catalogs and handwritten ledgers. Sam laid the folded mortgage letter in front of him and stared at it. The word swam a little as his eyes blurred, but he blinked it away, refusing the weakness. Weakness wouldn't pay the bank. Sentiment wouldn't stop the foreclosure notice from going up at the end of the drive. He leaned back and let his gaze drift around the kitchen. Every surface bore the quiet wear of a life spent scraping by, the chipped mugs, the faded curtains stitched by his mother's hands, the small radio on the counter that hadn't worked properly in years but still clicked on every morning out of habit. These things weren't just objects. They were ghosts, memories trapped in wood and fabric and silence. In the corner, the basket of preserved goods he had packed for Archie Miller still sat half empty. Sam had given away more than he could afford to lose. A box filled with canned jams, corn, and potatoes, a gift for a man who had even less. It would have been easy to regret that kindness now. He could have kept the food. He could have pretended he hadn't seen Archie's hunched figure limping down the road, could have turned away from the silent appeal in those tired eyes. Maybe then he would have had enough to scrape together another meal, another week, another small thread of hope to cling to. But deep inside, he knew he wouldn't change a thing. There were debts heavier than mortgages, debts of honor, of decency, that no bank could ever understand. To have turned Archie away would have been to lose something far more valuable than land or crops. It would have been to lose himself. Outside, the clouds clung stubbornly to the sky, a dull, smothering gray. The farmstead was utterly still, except for the gentle groan of the barn settling against the wind. The world had moved on without him, it seemed, leaving Sam and his broken fields behind like relics no longer needed. He sat at the table for hours without moving, the untouched thermos cooling further by his side. In his mind, he wandered through old memories, his father teaching him to set a fence post straight, his mother humming in the kitchen, the harvest festivals that once filled Willow Creek with laughter and bonfire smoke. Those days felt like another life entirely. A single tear welled in the corner of his eye, but he blinked it away before it could fall. There would be no hero to save him this time. No second chances. No small, unexpected fortune waiting in the mailbox. Only the slow, grinding machinery of loss, moving forward with the inevitability of winter. Still, as he folded the mortgage notice neatly and tucked it back into his jacket pocket, a small ember of stubbornness burned inside him. A belief too deeply rooted to be washed away even by the fiercest storm. Kindness, even when it cost everything, was never wrong. And as he watched the broken horizon through the dirt-smeared window, Sam Harrison made peace with whatever was coming. He had given without hesitation, and now he would lose without bitterness. Sometimes, that was all a man could do. The morning after the storm, Sam rose before the sun, though there was no real reason to. Habit still pulled him from the bed, even when hope no longer did. His body moved through the familiar motions, pulling on worn jeans, lacing up boots caked with yesterday's mud, each act mechanical, like a clock unwinding itself out of duty rather than purpose. The farmhouse creaked as he moved through it, the sound of old timber sighing in sympathy. He poured a thin cup of coffee, black and bitter, and stepped outside into a world that smelled of damp earth and defeat. The sky was still low and brooding, thick with the remnants of the storm. Wisps of mist clung to the ground, swirling around the gnarled fence posts like restless spirits. The field stretched out before him, flattened and broken, the colors muted as if grief itself had drained them dry. Sam set out walking toward the edge of his property, toward the county road that bordered the last of the Harrison land. His steps were slow but steady, the kind of steps a man takes when he already knows what he'll find, yet feels bound to see it with his own eyes. Each footfall left a deep print in the saturated earth, a trail marking the passage of a man too stubborn to stay inside and too proud to hide from his losses. As he neared the old wooden gate, he saw something strange. At first, it seemed like another trick of the fog, dark shapes looming in the distance, half-formed and shifting. But as he drew closer, the forms sharpened. Vehicles. A long caravan of them, parked in solemn procession along the county road, engines idling softly in the heavy morning air. Military vehicles. Armored trucks, their matte green paint slick with rain, stood in a row like silent sentinels. Jeeps with National Guard insignias lined up behind them. And among them, several civilian SUVs and vans, their logos unfamiliar but their purpose unmistakable. Sam's heart thudded once in his chest, a heavy, uncertain beat. For a brief, absurd moment, he wondered if some emergency had brought them here, if perhaps the Guard was deploying for flood rescue or storm cleanup. But that hope withered almost immediately. There were too many of them. They were not passing through. They had come here. To him. He moved closer, boots squelching in the wet gravel of the road. A few figures stepped out from the line of vehicles, uniforms crisp despite the mud, their faces solemn but expectant. At the center of them stood a man Sam almost didn't recognize. Archie Miller. Gone was the tattered jacket and road-weary shuffle. In its place stood a figure straight-backed and proud, dressed in a full formal military uniform that gleamed even under the dull sky. Medals lined his chest like a field of stars, ribbons bright against the deep green of his jacket. Sam froze, unsure if he was still trapped in some cruel dream conjured by exhaustion and despair. Archie stepped forward, and as he did, a hush seemed to fall over the scene. The murmuring engines faded. The mist pulled back. It was as if the world itself had paused to bear witness. Behind Archie, other figures disembarked. Officers in dress blues. Men and women in sharp suits bearing folders and official seals. The emblems on their jackets spoke of veteran foundations, agricultural cooperatives, and national service organizations. Sam's mind spun, unable to assemble the pieces into anything that made sense. Archie's voice, when it came, was strong and sure, carrying across the empty fields with the weight of command. He spoke briefly, formally, explaining what Sam had never imagined. That Archie had not always been a forgotten man wandering rural backroads. Once, he had been General Archibald Miller, a commander who had served in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. Decorated not for his rank alone, but for acts of valor few dared to speak about. And when the world moved on without him, when the wars ended and the flags were folded, Archie had chosen a different kind of retirement. He had walked away from accolades and fortune, seeking something smaller, something quieter. He had chosen humility over recognition. But acts of kindness, Archie said, could never remain hidden forever. When Sam had offered him food, when he had given freely without asking for gratitude, he had unknowingly extended his hand to a man still deeply connected to circles of influence and loyalty that spanned the nation. And Archie, moved beyond words by the simple decency he had been shown, had made a few quiet calls. Veteran organizations. Agricultural foundations. Private donors who owed Archie debts of their own, debts of friendship and honor. Together, they had rallied, not out of pity, but out of respect for a man who understood that dignity was measured not by wealth or power, but by what one was willing to give away when no one was looking. Sam stood rooted to the spot as trucks began to unload. New equipment, tractors, plows, seeders, machines he could never have dreamed of affording. Pallets of supplies for rebuilding the farmhouse. Bundles of irrigation tubing designed for drylands like Willow Creek, technology that could breathe life into even the thirstiest soil. There were architects and planners too, people tasked with designing something larger than just a revived farm. A new model, a place where veterans could learn agricultural *LLS, where returning soldiers could find peace and purpose in working the land. Sam's throat tightened unbearably as he watched it unfold. The same neighbors who had pitied him, who had whispered about his foolishness in helping a ragged stranger, were gathering along the edges now, drawn by the sight of the convoy. They stood in silence, their faces a mirror of the stunned awe Sam himself felt. For the first time in years, Sam Harrison felt the full, staggering weight of being seen, not as a man on the brink of failure, but as a man who had quietly, stubbornly done what was right. The cold morning mist swirled around him, and Sam gripped the worn railing of the gate to steady himself. A faint tremor passed through his hands, but he did not wipe the tears that blurred his vision. He let them fall. Sometimes, the harvest comes not from the seeds a man sows in the earth, but from those he plants unseen in the hearts of others. And on that broken stretch of Montana farmland, amidst the ruins of drought and storm, a different kind of seed was beginning to bloom. Sam stood frozen at the gate, the cold mist clinging to his skin, the breath rising from his mouth like smoke. For a long time, he couldn't make himself move. It was too much, the trucks, the uniforms, the silent gathering of people who had once only offered wary glances. His body, exhausted from months of hardship, didn't know whether to collapse or keep standing out of sheer stubbornness. He watched as Archie stepped closer, each stride sure and dignified, the weight of forgotten honors stitched neatly onto his uniform. But it wasn't the medals or the stripes that struck Sam hardest, it was the quiet authority in Archie's eyes, the kind of authority that doesn't need to shout to be heard. A life lived for others had carved that presence into the old soldier's very being. Sam finally found the strength to lift the latch and open the gate. It swung wide with a rusty groan that seemed almost ceremonial in the silence. Archie reached out his hand, not in the casual way of neighbors, but with the solemnity of one equal recognizing another. Sam gripped it firmly, the calluses on their palms meeting like a secret handshake forged through hardship. In the stillness, the officers and civilians behind Archie began to arrange themselves into a respectful semicircle. Some held clipboards, some carried folded flags, others simply stood with hands clasped behind their backs, waiting. It was then that Sam noticed the reporters. 3 vans with satellite dishes sat further down the road, their logos familiar from national networks. Cameramen moved discreetly, trying not to disrupt the gravity of the moment, but their lenses were fixed firmly on Sam and Archie. Archie's voice cut through the thick morning air, deep and unwavering. He began to tell the story that Sam himself barely understood, the story that had rippled outward from one box of food given without fanfare. He spoke of service and sacrifice, of farms abandoned and veterans forgotten. He spoke of what it meant for one man, struggling against the crushing weight of his own survival, to offer what little he had to another without expectation of reward. Archie recounted Sam's act not as charity, but as something sacred, a reminder that real service doesn't end when the uniform comes off, and real courage isn't always found on battlefields. The words, simple and unadorned, carried more weight than any medal. As Archie spoke, Sam noticed others stepping forward, men and women in civilian clothes, some with canes, some missing limbs, some with faces lined by a different kind of weathering. Veterans. Survivors. Witnesses to lives built from resilience. They had traveled from towns and cities Sam had never even heard of, drawn here by the quiet gravity of a story that resonated with something deep inside them. Among them was a woman in her 30s, a little girl clinging to her leg, her other hand carefully holding a photograph pressed against her chest. She looked at Sam with such raw gratitude that it nearly undid him. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. But in her eyes, he saw it all, the fear, the relief, the profound understanding that sometimes the kindness of strangers was the only thread that kept a person from unraveling. A man in a National Guard uniform stepped forward next, carrying a polished oak box cradled in both hands. Sam's breath caught in his throat as the man opened it to reveal a plaque, its gold lettering simple but heavy with meaning. For service beyond measure. To Sam Harrison, whose kindness rekindled hope in fields once thought barren. Below the inscription was a single coin, a war coin, unmistakable in its design. Heavy. Irreplaceable. A symbol not just of gratitude, but of fraternity, of an unspoken promise that he would never again be left to stand alone. The officer presented it without a word, bowing his head slightly as Sam accepted the box with trembling hands. Behind him, the townspeople of Willow Creek stood gathered along the fence line, their faces a mixture of shame and wonder. The same people who had once crossed the street to avoid Archie now watched with wide, disbelieving eyes as history unfolded on the very road they had thought belonged only to their small routines. Among them, Sam recognized the bank manager who had sent the foreclosure notices, the neighboring farmers who had muttered about foolishness and waste. They stood silent now, like trees caught in a sudden, humbling storm. And in that silence, something shifted. It wasn't loud or obvious. There were no cheers, no sudden exclamations. It was a quieter thing, a collective holding of breath, a slow, reluctant awakening to the realization that decency, true decency, could not be measured in crop yields or mortgage payments. It lived in smaller acts, unnoticed and uncelebrated, until one day they blossomed into something undeniable. Archie concluded his speech by removing his hat and placing it over his heart. He looked directly at Sam and said, in a voice that carried across the fields and into the very bones of those listening, that real heroes don't seek battles, they seek to heal what has been broken. The moment held, suspended in the heavy air. And then, one by one, the people lining the road removed their hats too, following the old general's lead. Farmers, shopkeepers, children clutching their parents' hands, even the bank manager stood bareheaded, his mouth pressed into a tight, guilty line. The rain-swollen earth seemed to breathe beneath Sam's feet as he stood there, holding the plaque and the coin against his chest like a shield, feeling a weight lift that he hadn't even known he was carrying. In that gathering, in the soft clatter of hats being clutched against hearts, Sam found a kind of redemption no court or contract could ever provide. It wasn't about saving the farm anymore. It was about saving something far more precious. The belief that even in a world fraying at the edges, one man's quiet goodness could still, somehow, mend it. The days that followed passed in a blur of motion and disbelief. What had once been a lonely stretch of dying farmland became a hive of purpose, alive with the sound of hammers, engines, and voices lifted in shared labor. Trucks came daily, heavy with lumber, with irrigation pipes, with crates of seeds wrapped carefully against the lingering chill. Sam hardly knew where to start. For so long, his days had been filled with battles against losing crops, losing land, losing hope. Now, for the first time in years, the battle was for building something, for growing again. The new tractor arrived first, gleaming in the weak winter sun like a promise made solid. Sam ran his hand along its side, the metal still warm from the long haul it had made to get there. Beside it, a team of volunteers installed a state-of-the-art drip irrigation system, explaining with quiet excitement how it would transform the dry soil into something fertile again. Sam listened carefully, soaking up every word. The foundation leaders and agricultural advisors weren't just rebuilding what had been lost, they were planting something bigger. A new future. A center for veterans to come and learn the SK*LLS of farming, to find healing in the earth the way soldiers once found strength in each other. At first, Sam doubted anyone would come. Who would travel all the way to Willow Creek, Montana, to learn how to coax stubborn land into life? But the first letter arrived within a week, carefully typed and full of tentative hope. Then another. And another. A young man from Arizona who couldn't sit still after the war and needed something to steady him. A woman from Michigan who had lost her unit and wanted to find roots again. A father from North Dakota who missed the simplicity of dirt under his fingernails after the noise and chaos of combat. They came slowly, then in a trickle, then in a steady, determined stream. Sam worked beside them, teaching what he knew, how to mend a fence with wire and willpower, how to read the clouds before the rain arrived, how to tell when the corn was ready just by the feel of the husk. But he learned too. New techniques, new ideas. The farm became a living thing again, growing not just crops but community. The main barn was converted into a classroom, the smell of hay mingling with chalk dust and fresh coffee. Sam kept the battered thermos on the front table, a quiet anchor to remind him where this all began. One wall of the barn was reserved for photographs. Every veteran who passed through added a picture, some in uniform, some holding shovels instead of rifles, each a small square of testimony stitched into the fabric of the place. At the center of the wall hung the plaque and the war coin, mounted with care. Below them, a simple phrase painted in steady, black letters. Kindness without question is enough. Word spread further than Sam ever dreamed it could. Local newspapers first, then state broadcasts, then a national news feature that sent visitors trickling into Willow Creek with cameras and curious eyes. But even as attention grew, the farm remained what it had always been meant to be, a quiet refuge for those who needed it most. One afternoon, standing by the newly planted orchard, Sam watched as a group of veterans worked shoulder to shoulder, laughing easily, moving with the fluid choreography of those who had learned to trust again. A familiar figure walked up the dirt path toward him, Archie, his steps slower now but still steady, a cane tapping rhythmically against the packed earth. They didn't need to say much. They stood together in the warm breeze, watching rows of young trees sway gently under the wide Montana sky. Sam thought of everything it had cost to get here. The nights spent wondering if the land could hold out another year. The days when kindness seemed foolish. The loneliness so deep it could swallow a man whole if he let it. And he thought, too, of a box of canned goods given freely to a stranger on a cracked road. A seed, planted without expectation, now grown into something sprawling and strong. As the sun dipped low and the fields caught fire in its golden light, Sam found himself smiling, not the tight, worn smile he used to offer the world, but something easier, something real. He would lose the farm, he had once thought. And maybe, in some way, he had. The Harrison land was no longer just his. It belonged to everyone who had found a second chance in its soil. And that, he realized, was a richer inheritance than any bank account could measure. Even in loss, even in the breaking, something stronger had taken root. Sometimes, the smallest acts echo loudest across the years. A plate of food. A cup of coffee. A warm glance when the world had grown cold. Sam understood now, the land had never been just dirt and seed. It had been the quiet, stubborn hope of countless lives, passed from hand to hand, heart to heart. He picked up a handful of earth and let it fall slowly through his fingers. The farm, the veterans, the long afternoons beneath the open sky, they were all proof of the same truth. Kindness, given without question, had changed everything. And it always would.